Hello, welcome to this Blue Check Ukraine webcast, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Michael Goldfarb. I'm one of the founders of Blue Check, and I have the privilege of moderating today's event. Our conversation today is as timely as it is necessary. Russia's brutal war on Ukraine has entered its second year and shows no signs of abating. And while battlefield developments are well documented, the worsening humanitarian crisis deserves closer examination. With us today is a panel of experts who will share direct insights into a key factor exacerbating the deepening needs on the ground: the massive international funding shortfall for Ukraine's NGO and civil society sector, which, as we'll discuss, is more than capable of meeting the needs, but is hamstrung by a lack of necessary resources. Joining us today are Jason Cohn, a co-founder of Blue Check and former executive director of Doctors Without Borders USA. Yana Lomaka is a grants officer at Life Quality Fund, a Ukrainian NGO and Blue Check grantee, who's joining us live from Ukraine. Murphy Poindexter, a co-founder of Blue Check, who will share his reflections and other insights on his time in Ukraine amongst Blue Check grantees. Amanda Rad, partner at the law firm Ropes and Gray, which provides Blue Check with critical pro bono due diligence and compliance support, more than $1 million in support to date. And Abby Stoddard, founder and partner of Humanitarian Outcomes, a UK-based research organization that's revealed massive shortcomings in the international humanitarian aid system as it relates to Ukraine. So we'll have a discussion for approximately 45 to 50 minutes, followed by a Q&A. You can submit your questions at any time in the chat function, and they will be provided to me, at which point I'll get to them towards the end of our conversation. I can't guarantee that we'll be able to get to every single question that's submitted, but we will certainly do our best. So without further ado, let's jump right in with Abby. Abby, in many ways, the research findings of your organization, Humanitarian Outcomes, illustrates the very reason, frankly, Blue Check Ukraine exists, and is really why we're gathered here today for this discussion. Please walk us through the significance and implications of the glaring inequity in international aid funding, and of how Ukraine's very capable NGO and civil society sectors have been left behind.
Okay, well, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate being invited here today and having the opportunity to share our research. And I believe that some of my colleagues and co-authors from the second phase of our report are also participating on the call: Nigel Timmons and Anastasia Bondarenko. So shout out to them. So, as you said, I think what we're seeing play out in Ukraine is a model of international humanitarian response that's not quite fit for purpose, and which in some sense can't get out of its own way. And the funding piece is a big part of that. So I'm going to start by sketching out how ideally this is supposed to work, and how I think a lot of people were hoping it would work a year ago when the war first broke out. And then I'll get into the dysfunction and the bottlenecks that we're seeing. So I know it's a mixed crowd on the call today. I think probably many of you already know that the fuel that really drives a humanitarian aid response to a massive crisis like this is funding that's provided from major government donors, specifically the US, the European Commission, Germany, Japan, and like half a dozen or so other mostly Western governments. And then in some high profile emergencies like Ukraine, you will get a surge of private funding at the onset, so funds from individuals and foundations. So last year, the private funding for Ukraine was over $155 million, which is quite a lot relative to other humanitarian emergencies. It's almost as much as what the government of France provided, and they were the fourth largest government donor to Ukraine. But the thing about private funding is that it tends to come in a big wave at the onset and isn't sustainable over the long term. So when you have a crisis lasting years, and unfortunately we are moving into year 2 of this war, it tends to decline, and you have the same small group of governments that provide the grants to the organizations in the countries that are providing the aid. And so over the past couple of decades, as the humanitarian funding volumes increase, these donor governments have reduced their capacity to manage all the multiple small grants. And their tendency has been to funnel larger and larger amounts to a smaller number of large recipient agencies, such as the UN agencies and some of the major international NGOs. And they count on them to then distribute it to a network of partners, both international and local, and their international partners have their networks of local partners that they distribute to, and then it sort of cascades down through these sub-grants. So the international agencies are meant to be more than pass-through. So the idea is that they add something to this. They bring economies of scale and efficiencies. And for instance, they can provide a single procurement mechanism and logistics platforms for all their partners, et cetera. But most importantly, they're meant to have this kind of large standing capacity to act quickly and provide a rapid response and ramp up operations and start the aid flowing right after the onset of the crisis. So that's pretty much how it's supposed to work. But what we saw in Ukraine with our first report at 3 months post-invasion was this massive surge in fundraising, which was unfortunately met with a lack of preparedness by the international organizations, including those that were already working on the ground since the first invasion in 2014, so in the East, and really painfully slow startup. So at month 3, the international organizations were just getting started doing their assessments and hiring, and the local NGOs and volunteer groups that sprung up after the invasion had been working very hard since the beginning, but without access to any of the international funds. So this slide that you're looking at now just shows the operational presence of organizations on the ground. And the internationals is rightly a small part of that, but sort of when you think about the proportion of funding they control, it's quite incommensurate. So what we're talking about, so here's the funding. What you saw is that close to 80% of the direct funding had gone to the UN agencies and large international organizations at the beginning. Several of these large INGOs raised tens of millions of dollars from private sources on their websites within the first couple of weeks of the crisis. So they were still not operational on the ground, even though they were on lists that people look at to donate. You know, here are 10 groups that are working on Ukraine that you can donate to. So they were collecting this money without yet being operational. And nor were they able to transfer this money to groups that were operational, the local organizations in Ukraine. So these organizations that were working, that were trying to access funds, if they knew about the humanitarian system, met with really cumbersome application procedures, long waits for approvals on projects, and all of these kind of compliance requirements that really didn't make sense for a rapid onset emergency. It should not take 3 months to get a grant approved when you are evacuating people and getting people food and shelter, things like that. This needs to be faster. So we found that part of the problem was that these international organizations are hamstrung by their own compliance mechanisms that are demanded by donors, but nobody was being flexible about them and finding kind of innovative ways to work around them. We did see some of that. There were some workarounds, and some INGOs managed to move funds to local partners to put it to use, but not at any reasonable scale that would make a difference, right?
So Abby, really what you're describing really sounds like a system that is unfit for purpose, whereby you have, and if I recall the sort of the breakdown of your research was something in the area of 90% of the humanitarian relief work that was taking place during the period of your study. It was being conducted by Ukrainian NGOs, very capable NGOs, but they were receiving less than 1% of the international aid funding that had been raised. So that very stark discrepancy, I think, it really illustrates the problem that you're describing, the dilemma that you're describing. Jana, if we can transition over to you, because I think you're in a position to really illustrate the impact on the ground of this funding discrepancy. As an aid worker with Life Quality Fund, a Ukrainian civil society organization, you can really address firsthand the unique challenges your organization is facing in both meeting the needs on the ground in terms of the war itself, but also in terms of the inadequate international funding environment. Can you share with us your own thoughts and experiences on those two issues?
Yes. First of all, of course, let me express my gratitude for invitation and for allowing me to be here at this panel. It's my honor, and I would like to thank all of you for what you are doing for the Ukraine and for the Ukrainians. Thank you for your support. Thank you for sounding the alarm. Thank you for talking about these challenges and problems. Thank you very much. Back to the question. You asked about the challenges that we are experiencing, and today challenges are a little bit different than what was, for example, at the beginning of the war, because at the beginning, we all were overwhelmed because we were here in the Ukraine, and we were overwhelmed, first of all, by this reality that this thing was actually happening, that the rockets were actually flying, and we had to really adapt somehow. Also, the challenge was the needs. We had to make fast decisions at the beginning. We had to react rapidly because we haven't experienced such things before, like rapid evacuations, collecting different aid for those who volunteered to protect the country, for the civilians, even evacuating the animals, all of this was challenging. Well, still is. At the beginning, everything was raw, spontaneous in many ways. But today marks, I think it's 393rd day of the war, day 393. And we still have challenges, but, we already have some experience. And in terms of the war, the challenges are, people live in constant danger of the shelling, of the rockets. People have this crazy emotional state because they have to live with the continual air raid alerts. I personally, right now, live in Zakarpattia region. This is one of the safer, so-called safe regions, but still I hear this raid alarm on a daily basis. I cannot imagine what those people who live closer, how they must feel. So these are some of the challenges, and I'll connect it to the charity. Also, the poverty of the population who lost the jobs and the means to live, lack of local budgets to fully support communities. So in terms of inadequate international funding environment, I can only share our story. We began to knock on the doors of the international charity groups since March. And we, of course, tried to get in touch with some larger big names, because we realized that, they may help, they probably have the means to help. But most of them didn't reply at all. Some of them, they send us the automatic answers saying that we have to register. And the procedure for the registration was so complicated that we just were not able to register at all. So one of the first groups that responded to us was Global Empowerment Mission. Such organization, they answered us and they supported us in our first project. And since then, they are a faithful partner and they do lots of great work in Ukraine. Also, a global giving platform, they responded to us and their procedure was much easier, and they supported us in some project as well, and now coming back to Blue Check Ukraine. You also stretched your hand of support to us after some due diligence, but that due diligence process was clear and it was like accessible for us.
Okay, thank you, Yana. Switching to the the specific needs on the ground. One of the areas of support that Life Quality Fund provides is distributing food kits, emergency medical kits, et cetera. Can you just give us a sense, a more granular sense of some of the specific needs that the civilian population is facing? How do you and your colleagues decide, determine what to include in, say, an emergency food kits or the medical kits? How they where they're distributed to, what goes into that decision making? You talked about, especially in the beginning stages of the war, having to pivot very quickly, and I think that's one of the unique strengths of the local NGO sector. You all have the knowledge, the insights, the networks, the intimate knowledge of the terrain, et cetera. So maybe just walk us through for a minute or two on the decision-making process in terms of targeting the aid.
Okay, well, when we were first considering the formation of such food kits, or we were even calling them survival packages, food survival packages at the beginning, because that was the case, we understood that each person needs a certain minimum. So at the very beginning, we took as an example an approximate ration of a military person, because we needed some examples. So we were just looking what can sustain a person for a little while. So eventually we had to adjust the food kits to a minimum, unfortunately, because we wanted to provide as many people as possible. So that was how we were deciding what to put in the food kits. We knew that, we needed something that people could cook, something that could sustain a family at least for a little bit. With medical kits, we decided to contact the health authorities, and we agreed with them on the minimum, supply of medicines that could be purchased without prescription. And when we were doing this project with the Blue Check, the medical kits, and we were distributing them here in the Western Ukraine among the IDPs, among the internally displaced people. And I don't know how it's in the States or in the world, but in Ukraine, we have these two seasons, autumn and end of the winter, spring, when people get really sick, because of all the season changing. And many people, they were just coming and saying thank you for the medicines, because they could use it for their kids, for their families. We usually, our foundation, we receive lots of requests from individuals and also from the territorial communities. Right now, our method of work, we try to establish some connection with the territorial communities, with the local authorities, and we try to provide them with help instead of working with individuals, because right now we see it as most efficient way of working. So whenever we hear about different regions and we hear about their requests, we try to send aid to them. But in order to do that, we have to have it available in our warehouse. And this is where the help of the grantors comes in.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Yana, for that. I'd like to hand over to Jason now. Can you share, please, with our audience, Blue Check's origin story, our unique approach to streamlining funding for humanitarian aid in Ukraine, and our, quote, disruptive character, and linking back to the kind of the problem set that Abby had outlined at the outset of our gathering here, and how that really illustrates are Blue Check's real mission and purpose.
Thanks, Michael. And just want to say thank you to all the people who've joined us, many of whom are big financial supporters of Blue Check. Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of this started honestly with just so many other people who wanted to be involved and help. And our colleague Harris Fishman, who's helping to bring up those slides you've just been seeing, is someone that we worked together on a project at Doctors Without Borders a number of years ago. And he, like so many other people, I think, just picked up the phone and called and said, hey, can we get involved here? What can we do? And that really spawned from his work with other colleagues that we have, Margaret Pollock and Sophie Shield, who also, and Aaron Petterer, who were involved in the Anne Frank House work. And many of those teachers that were talking about the experience and the history of Anne Frank in Ukraine were being displaced. And Harris's call was really about how do we help those people? And another group that was eventually became one of our first partners, which was Ukraine Needs You, which is providing remote mental health and virtual help, group sessions for people for psychological support. And so, that beget Michael and I, who worked together at Doctors Without Borders, coming together and trying to find like-minded individuals. And that brought us to Liev Schreiber, who Harris had known from his college days. And really, to Liev's credit, wanted to act, but wanted to push us beyond just one project, supporting one organization like Ukraine Needs You. And Liev went first to World Central Kitchen in Poland, and then through contacts that myself and Michael, and also Murphy Poindexter, who's going to tell us a little bit about his work as one of the other co-founders, were able to get him into Ukraine last April, basically. And he met groups like the Symphony Orchestra in Lviv, which, as you can see from this picture, piles and piles of aid in front of the orchestra as they rehearse Mozart's Requiem. And that, in many ways was the story we were seeing countlessly around. And Liev met other partners who we eventually funded as well, who are coming together. Jan is very modest. I mean, basically, Life Quality Fund is, in many ways, history is rooted as a bunch of private companies that came together, and first to really help their own staff and then help their communities, right? And time and again, we're seeing this play out across Ukraine. And so the impetus was, how do we help? How are we useful, right? And as someone who helped to run a large organization that was part of that humanitarian sort of monopoly, if you will, that Abby was describing earlier, who through oftentimes because of good programming, but also because of a massive marketing machine that is able to get on those New York Times lists, that is to get into your inbox with email marketing, that's able to target the ads to you. You decide to give. Your solidarity, your choices are made in the first 72 hours to give of most of these crises. And you don't know about these groups. You don't know about Life Quality Fund. You don't know about Spivdia. You don't know about TAPS Ukraine. This is a story that's played out in places like Haiti, places like South Sudan, many other places that Michael and I had worked. But what pushed us, I think, was honestly, you can know how the system functions from within. You can understand it, as Abby has described, from a very deep understanding. But until you're confronted by colleagues like Liev and Murphy, who brought his own experience of trying to be disruptive in the financial sector space, and people asking you, why is it that way? Do you start to begin to think about how you can disrupt that way? And let's be modest. We've funded a little over 20 organizations. We've raised, about $1.3 million of grants, but it's part of a larger story that is about, first and foremost, helping people who, not for lack of courage, ability, understanding, and cultural understanding, are able to do things. They're limited just by the means in the network. And this absolutely Kafkaesque bureaucratic system that is put in place and in front of them that prevents them from accessing those resources. And so at the forefront of our mind was, yes, we need to address donors' trust. There was a lot of rumors about, corruption being endemic in the state in Ukraine. So what did we do? We had to partner with credible groups like Ropes and Gray and others. And I really want to thank and acknowledge someone named Don Vieira, who helped us to make the connection with Ropes and Gray, who we worked with at Doctors Without Borders on different issues. But to get that seal approval, but don't make that seal approval the burden of the people doing the work. Make it your burden as a funder. Make it your burden as a donor, right? Not their burden who are out on the front line listening to the air raid sirens that Yana has heard. And so, that's why, and bring Murphy in now just to talk about that because he was on the ground as well. But I think those are the kinds of questions we're asking, and we're trying to prompt and needle the system while first and foremost, just be useful to people in Ukraine and help them at this time. So.
Thanks, Jason. Indeed. Let's bring in Murphy. You've been on the ground in Ukraine. You've witnessed the local aid groups in action, groups like Life Quality Fund and others. You've interacted with the people where Blue Check and its grantees are assisting. Can you, describe your impressions of our Ukrainian partners, the impact of Blue Check's model to our audience? I think you're on mute, Murphy.
I almost never do that, but the one time I'm on a huge webinar, I guess I do. It's great. Firstly, I think human resilience or courage, whatever you want to call it, was definitely on display. And the Ukrainians have a unique brand of it. It was almost surreal being in Kyiv and Lviv, as there is a war going on, as there is a lot of, I spent a night in the basement of a hotel in Kyiv. And it's just incredible. Everybody's doing the work. I think, I'm borrowing this word from Liev, but he says something when something happens on the ground, you go to your neighbor's house, and they're the ones that will usually have an extra Band-Aid or an extra loaf of bread or sort this out. And that efficacy was on display. So Svivdia, I spent a lot of time with, and they focus on the youth being activated to help communities. And we met 19-year-olds that were packaging up kits similar to what Yana showed before, and 23-year-olds playing with kids from the east that had relocated west. I tried to do some magic tricks, but the language barrier was really high. They seemed to figure it out as well, so that was on me. But it was incredible just to see how much they can do with the resources they have. And the resounding message was, with more resources, they could just exponentially do more, which spoke to the model. And I think we had a question come in about what percentage of donations, as we're sort of talking about this. When we started, it was purely volunteer. I think 99 point some cents on the dollar went to Ukraine. And as this platform is growing, we're trying to make it sustainable and do it where it's a two-way street. And I think that the key point about Blue Check that is interesting is we did talk about Ropes and Gray providing confidence to the international donors. But I think the real secret of what Ropes and Gray and Integrity Risk International are doing is taking the burden off the locals. So everyone that feels a little hopeless watching what's going on, or everybody that thinks I only have a tiny thing I can do, which is, some of the checks we received for $20 have some of the nicest notes I've ever seen. And then in the same thing with feedback from the ground, Strenki and some of the elderly we got to visit in Kyiv, just super appreciative of anything and everything. I think, knowing people are there and around you is just as important as receiving some of that aid. So that was, I guess the main message was, it's about awareness, it's about connection, and about action. If that all makes sense.
Yeah, and just as an explainer, that last image that you saw, a group of elderly people, that's they're gathered at thanks to a wonderful organization that Blue Check is supporting called Strenki, which is dedicated to assisting, supporting, protecting one of the most vulnerable populations in this conflict, which is the elderly. Very often they're isolated, they're alone, they're trapped, and they need a really specialized support and care. And so Murphy had the privilege of being able to spend some time at one of their centers. And as you saw, just in that brief photo, this is tailor-made support for just one population that's uniquely vulnerable. Thank you, Murphy. Amanda, I'd like to hand it over to you. Your firm, Ropes and Gray, is a critical pro bono partner of Blue Check, together with Integrity Risk International. As I said from the outset, the sheer amount of support that your firm has provided has been an absolute game changer. Without it, we really wouldn't be able to do what we're doing and get this support to our partners on the ground. Can you please walk us through and describe some of the essential due diligence protocols and procedures that Ropes and Gray is utilizing for vetting Blue Check's on the ground partners to ensure their credibility in the eyes of donors and to adequately fund them as swiftly as possible, which is really the core of our mandate?
Sure. So first, thanks very much. It's nice to see you all. And it's much a privilege for all of us at Ropes and Gray to be able to be with you on this journey. And one of the first things that happened, like everyone else that's listening here and part of the panel, when the war started in Ukraine, there was a flood of calls and emails and everyone saying, what can we do to help? And I think a lot of us experienced that, and a lot of us didn't know exactly where to pour some of that energy. And this partnership has been a really nice way for a lot of people to be able to really feel like they're able to make a small difference. So thank you for that. So I am my everyday day job. I am the co-leader of our global anti-corruption and international risk practice. So one of the things that I do all the time for corporate clients all over the world is help them think about companies that they may be looking to invest in or partners that they may be looking to work with. We and our team will look and say, do due diligence, compliance due diligence, risk due diligence to understand who is this entity, who are the people behind the entity, what risks may exist, whether they be fraud risk, corruption risks, sanctions risks, export control risks, money laundering risks. I mean, the list goes, cultural concerns and risks, the list go on. And a lot of it is really about trying to get as much information as we can in as short a time as possible so that people can make decisions about how to move forward in a safe way and in an effective way. And so listening to this discussion today, the challenge of getting that information and being able to process it and for people to be able to act on it is a hard one. And it sounds like from listening to Yana, really difficult for the recipient too, right? To be able to have all these processes and procedures that they have to be able to go through in a time of crisis, by the way, but to be able to at least feed enough information back in to the organization so that some kinds of checks can be done. So what we really did was take the model that we use every day for our corporate clients and try to layer that on to build a process to work with all of you where you find the organizations that we can start to take a look at. And, in our everyday world, we work with partners like Integrity Risk International, and they have been our partner here to collect all of the relevant information that we can, hopefully in the most efficient, streamlined way, so it isn't too burdensome on Yana, and to also do the kind of outside in research that we would normally do and prepare kind of an overview of the relevant risks that we see and background that we see, ask follow-up questions where necessary, and then hopefully put that together in a digestible format for you all to be able to act on, to review and make decisions on, and give people some comfort that there's process behind the work being done and that we can really understand where the money's going and to who it's going to in a condensed time period.
Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful for our audience to understand how we're able to swiftly fund groups, because as Abby had pointed out earlier, that's really where the bottleneck is. And Abby, just picking up off of what Amanda was saying, can you share with us some of the concrete recommendations that Humanitarian Outcomes has made, in addition to its research findings, on isolating those bottlenecks and suggesting what kind of adjustments to the system are necessary in order for groups like Life Quality Fund and others to access this massive pool of money? Because as Jason said, we should be modest here. We're a small entity. We can't possibly meet the needs, but there is this massive pool of money that is largely inaccessible to the most impactful NGOs on the ground, that, thanks to the work of Amanda and her colleagues, are vetted. They can be trusted. They're credible. They're reliable. So can you maybe share with us where the international system can make some improvements and adjustments to streamline the flow of much needed resources?
Sure. As you say, that what we need is a way to enable direct and timely funding to go to the groups that can put it to work right away. And also, I would add to keep the source of private funds flowing even as the spotlight moves away from the crisis. So, I mean, the international community has already made clear stated commitments and goals for something called localization, which is that at least 25% of funding for humanitarian assistance should go to local actors. And that's not for some, advocacy reason, like to help these organizations, but it's because you get better outcomes on the ground by having a strong, well-supported civil society sector, and not by concentrating funding in the international agencies and starving the local sector, making them completely dependent on the international organizations. So the donors and the agencies need to adjust their compliance systems to be able to be responsive to the context, to take there's a lot of talk about the no regrets approach, like we just push the money out and deal with the consequences later. That was not how it went in Ukraine. There was such stringent compliance, you would think that it was not a major emergency. What Jana was talking about also was it struck a chord, because we actually did research years ago that showed that the smaller and less capacitated a local organization was, the more burden they had in terms of reporting and applications and requirements. So it's completely off kilter. So more money directly to local NGOs and volunteer groups that are organizing. Less cumbersome, more supportive partnership contracts, so that you're not just transferring all the burden of compliance and risk onto your local partners. Fair overheads and indirect cost allowances for these local organizations, and a sense of investing in supporting them. The international organizations who are not able to operate themselves in some areas can provide support services to these local actors and give them the training and the security inputs and equipment, for instance, that they need to keep themselves and their staff safe. Then basically just break this state of dependence, which makes no sense.
Mm-hmm. That was one thing we also discovered, and I think, Amanda, beyond your team at Ropes, we have to sort of thank all the teams that have been supporting us, because there's all these small moving parts to facilitating grants. The corporate team has helped us not get in trouble countless times and also sort of optimize the process. And that's what we also hope Blue Check can do, is anyone with a smaller skill or a different skill set, apply it to facilitating this funding. It's been incredible.
Jason, can you also just highlight some of the other groups that Blue Check is supporting,
Sure.
and the very impactful work that they're doing?
Yeah, so I think if you go to the website bluecheck.in, you can see at the bottom logos of many of the organizations that we have partnered with so far, and we're building that list hopefully every day. I think one thing to point out, and it sort of touches on a little bit what Abby's saying, is like, we've tried to think about our funding of organizations to be really cognizant of their needs. So Michael alluded to the group Steranki, for example, that we fund and has a targeted approach to supporting the elderly, particularly elderly who have no other dependents to rely on. When I was talking to Varvara, the head of Steranki, she said, they had the funds and the support to sort of meet the material needs, but they didn't have like the staffing to manage the programs. So our first grant to them was actually funding people to manage the programs and run and do effective programs. Our next grant to them was to fund the warm kits, which were basically blankets and heaters for isolated elderly people who were trapped in buildings and upper floors and, the winter. But our first grant was responsive to their need. What was their need, right? And so I think we have to take, oftentimes as funders, and I work for a large one in New York City at the Robin Hood Foundation as my part of my day job, is that we need to be responsive to what is going to help them be most effective, right? And listen to them rather than putting our own biases as a donor on what they need to do that work. So let's listen to them. So I think, some of those groups are, for example, a group called Spivdia. Spivdia is a wonderful network, a virtual network of young people across Ukraine. Murphy had the pleasure of meeting some of the folks who founded that, who's really has built a database that gives a sense of need across the country. And they could tell you, who they're distributing to, what they need. And that's exactly what we did. We funded their operations because they have those insights. They built the systems, right? A lot of this is about also building systems built around need and real need, not assumptions of what the needs are. And you get that when you partner with a group like Svivdia. Another one, which is an affiliate of a U.S. organization, TAPS, that has done a lot of work with fallen soldiers, but in Ukraine is supporting, families that have lost loved ones on the front lines and have lost their income, and you can see here, this is one of the buildings that was severely damaged by one of the bombings, and some of the TAPS staff were killed. But they had a very specific response, in the mental health space, and also, again, adapting. One of those huge generators is what was delivered. This is a picture from Sterenki, again, just sort of addressing people's needs in all forms. Right? Deaths of despair and isolation for the elderly is a real thing, right? So a Tea Party, yes, it's not as hard hitting as when we funded a program to replace a surgical table in one of the frontline hospitals, but it keeps people alive because they, and that's the kind of sort of breadth of organizations. So there was a question I think that came up in the chat was about how much money is, spent on gets to the field and stays home. So basically the people on this call from the Blue Check side, we're essentially volunteers. But we have made a commitment that at minimum, and that's basically been closer to, I would say, 98 to 99% of the funding that we receive goes to the field. And it goes to the organizations. We're more flexible about how they use that funding. For the very example I just gave with Sterenki, it's going to be what is the need for them to do the operations that are most effective and impactful. But we have a stated commitment of getting at least 90 cents of every dollar. We've been more in the 97 cents range, thanks to partners like Ropes and Gray and others who've given us support. But our commitment is at minimum 90 cents, and we're much higher than that to date.
Thanks, Jason. Amanda, we have a question from one of our audience members, Dave Herzog, and it's a pertinent one. How do you vet the local organizations before funding them? So maybe you can just briefly walk us through the nuts and bolts of the Ropes and Gray vetting process, not just the fact that it's a comparatively less cumbersome and swifter process, but what are some of the granular pieces of information that you're extracting from the potential grantees?
Yeah, so it does start with actually the information that we're able to collect and provide from the potential grantee. So we get as much information as we can, as efficiently as we can that way. But then we go through and we do a comprehensive media search ourselves of publicly available records against all available sanctions lists and sanctions databases, and are looking for any kind of red flags that we might see that way. Our partners, Integrity Risk International, who also work and concentrate in the reputational diligence and background check field, are also running these comprehensive background checks as well. So there's a pull from all of the research that we're able to pull from both Ropes and Gray and Integrity Risk International. It's pulling through all the responses to the diligence questions that we're asking of the potential recipients of the funds. Sometimes there's a back and forth with some additional questions that we may have based on the information that we're able to pull together on the record that the organization has, or their ownership, or who their partners are. And all of that is really pulled together into one kind of compliance recommendation diligence package. So I don't know if that gives you a little bit more of a flavor.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And Jason or Murphy, maybe you can just describe, the typical process from once the vetting and intake process is complete to then getting monies out the door. What kind of a time frame are we typically talking about? Knowing that time is of the essence.
In the most acute cases, we've actually around 2.5 weeks was our shortest, and that was for a grant that had a particularly urgent need. On average, everything from start to finish, though, is less than a month. Sometimes some organizations are quite complex. They have partner organizations and plenty of board members and plenty of key people, and so that can sometimes take a little bit more time just due to the complexity, but under a month. And we're trying constantly to improve that.
Yeah. And it's faster for the organizations we've already blue checked. So we've been giving follow-on grants to many of the organizations, as I mentioned, with Star and Key first to support some of their administrative capacity building, then the specific distributions. For Life Quality Fund, Yana, we've been talking and working for months, and we're approaching our third grant that we'll be bringing to the board for approval in the coming days. Or sorry, was just approved, and we're actually working on the transaction side of things. So our hope is, I think, particularly for the groups that we have done the vetting on, have a proven relationship, and they've done the reporting on the impact, that we're able to turn grants around very quickly. We just funded a group called Project Victory that was recently just helping to refurbish hospitals in the East, in Kharkiv and in Kherson. And they are preparing a proposal for us to refurbish one of the hospitals that was bombed. Our hope is that, we'll be able to turn that around really quickly because we've worked with them, they've documented the work, and there's no need to really get hugely in the details on every aspect because we've seen their work, their capability, and they've line item the expenses down to the nails for us. So that's about the trust. That's about the trust we need to have. And that's why what we're doing, and we hope, is very scalable with more funds basically from the donor community as well.
And in the Ukraine space, of course, where we have seen the very cynical and brutal deliberate targeting of medical facilities, of hospitals, of clinics, redolent, of course, of the Russian tactic that was utilized in Syria as well, and no reason to expect that this will diminish. So all the more reason why, Jason, I think it's critical that we remain engaged in supporting rehabilitation of medical facilities and making sure that they're up and running as quickly as possible. But it just underscores the need to get funds out as swiftly as possible to bypass that typically very cumbersome process that organizations encounter at the international level. Just a question about to Murphy. There have been myriad organizations that have emerged and funding platforms. The Ukrainian government, at the behest of the president's office, created United 24, which Blue Check has a relationship with, and this is a question that was posed from one of our audience members. What is Blue Check's relationship or level of coordination with U24, beyond the fact that our co-founder Liev Schreiber is a U24 ambassador, and how do our efforts, our comparative efforts, complement one another? You're muted again.
I'm muted again. Yes. So the key relationship really is Liev's ambassadorship. done a lot of work with awareness and spreading the word and acute needs on funding. For example, around Thanksgiving and Christmas of last year, there was a big drive for generators, and Liev and some other ambassadors were a huge part of that. I think the blue check in United 24 Connection is really around talking and listening to the Ministry of Health and listening to have more inputs of what the needs are on the ground. If we have a lot of organizations that say they need X, and the Ministry of Health is also saying there's a severe shortage of X, we know we've found something we need to focus on. And X has been anything from generators in the cold to insulin at certain times at the very beginning of the war. And there are these needs that come in that you maybe don't think about that much, but we are 100% and solely focused on the humanitarian aid and medical aid portion of the United 24 platform, as they have some other branches such as defense and demining and infrastructure that are sort of out of the blue check scope. Well, they're out of the blue check scope.
Okay. Thank you. Just checking, the chat form remains open, so if anybody has additional questions to share, now is a great time to submit them. Abby, just a question for you. Curious, just how the situation that you and your colleagues have uncovered in Ukraine, how that compares to other humanitarian crises elsewhere. If local organizations and in South Sudan, in Haiti, in Yemen, just a few of the places where there have been acute crises over the last several years, if you're seeing a similar dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ukraine is unique in a lot of ways, but the overall funding inequalities between the local and international aid sectors are really similar to most emergencies. And I think many of us thought it would be different in this case. I don't know why, but you're seeing the same patterns. I guess one difference is that Ukrainian NGOs seem to have more options for fundraising outside of the humanitarian sector, and they've been doing so. They've been which I find rather shocking, that most of their humanitarian funding has been coming from non-humanitarian donors, people that they've managed to find in other kinds of foundations and individuals. So they have more opportunities than, say, a local NGO in Eastern DRC, but very strange that they would have to avail themselves of that. So similar in that not enough funding going directly to NGOs, that you have these cumbersome and burdensome contracts and unfair contracts. And somebody mentioned the overheads in the questions, and I want to kind of make a plea for the overheads. It's the overheads that allow an organization to develop. It gives them the capacity to train their staff, sometimes to provide security equipment for their staff. It's important that if the UN agency gets 10% overhead for their grant from the US government, for instance, and many of them get more than that, that the local organization who is the end use provider gets fair overhead so that they can grow their capacity as well.
Okay.
One thing we did see on the ground is last August, I was able to visit, and Liev and I actually went from Kyiv to Lviv. There is an overwhelming amount of in-kind support. They have a lot of sweaters. They have a lot of things that are in these warehouses stacking up and stacking up. And in a situation like this, it's hard to have someone to handle those, to distribute those, to find out where they need to go. So Abby's point on operational capacity and helping locals to build that out is mission critical.
Thanks. Thanks both Murphy and Abby. Jana, just a question. One of the acute needs that's arisen in this war on Ukraine is the need for shelter, safe shelter. So many people millions of people have been displaced internally. Millions more forced from Ukraine and made into refugees. Can you discuss some of the work that Life Quality Fund is doing around meeting the shelter needs of people, and just more globally in the country as you see it, the particulars around the need for shelter?
Yes, yes. First of all, one of the main problems with the sheltering, people tend to flee to safer places. And safe places means it's harder to get a picture of a person standing in front of a destroyed house, if you understand what I mean. It means that many people, they are driven by the images, even those who give funds. And some of the regions, for example, you've shown this picture with the destroyed house. It really breaks the heart, and it really pushes people to give. But for example, here in the Western Ukraine, praise God, it's relatively safe. And it's hard for us to get such a bright pictures, to draw attention to the needs here. Because when when we distribute the aid over here to the IDPs, they are usually dressed well. They already have some peace because they have relocated. But the problem is some of them, they had to run and they end up in the places that were never meant to be shelters. Here, for example, in Zakarpattia, many of the schools, meaning educational facilities, they have become the shelters, and they were never meant to be the shelters. They don't have like showers. Some of them, they don't have the rooms. They don't have, basically, they're not prepared. And that's one of the serious needs, because some of the people, they say, well, we need to give to the front lines. But for example, right now, part of our fund is located here in the Western Ukraine, and we try to raise awareness to where, all of these places, they need either some of the repairs in the schools. For example, just last week we went to the school, and the principal, she was saying that she really needs help with the repairing of the showers, because at the same time, they need to have the school, the kids, they're going through the educational process, and some of the refugees are living in the nearby classes that used to be, for example, physics class, information class, or history classes, and now IDPs live in there. So one of the big things is what we try to do. We try to assess the cost of actually not building but repairing something into shelters. Also, what we try to do, we try to help with the repairs in these schools. Just recently, we were able to help one school to build the kitchen in the school, so they could use it for the IDPs, for the internally displaced people to cook in, because some of them, they don't even have the means where to cook. Some of them, they have to rely on some other charity organizations who would bring them food in, because I don't know how it's in the States, but here in some of the schools, you can't just find the room where you would cook your food, because it was never meant to be so. So that's one of the big problems. And it's not just in Zakarpattia, in some other regions as well, in some other central places as well. We also received one of the needs 2 weeks ago from Poltava region. One of the, also some of the educational places there, they have 9 or 10 people, and they just live in one room. And they asked us to help to buy them this, I don't know how you call it, like dividing walls, just the basic things, so they could at least have some privacy, one family from another. And refugees, they have experienced so much. Some of them, they have lost everything. Some of them have lost jobs. So we understand that they need good conditions, at least, to receive some kind of help. So shelters are very, very important things. And we have some NGOs who are already working on this, but the need is very high. And we think that it's something that many organizations have to help with. Pardon my English.
No,
I hope you understand everything.
absolutely. Thank you, Yana. No, that's very clear. And Jason, just pivoting from that kind of granularity of some of the acute needs that are being addressed. We have a question from Tatiana. You briefly mentioned, Jason, the impact reporting. So how does Blue Check, how do we think about impact measurements from our grantees? Yana just described some of the very specific activities that they are doing. Is that impact measurement part of our initial due diligence process? Do we require grantees to demonstrate impact flowing implementation of the program?
Yeah, so I think, part of our process has been, the front end due diligence that Amanda described, and then the conversation that happens and a little bit of trial with partners. So, I'll take, for example, the work that we helped to initially fund with Yana's group, Life Quality Fund, right? So, we're very clear on the front end, how is the funding going to be used? And the average grant size has been anywhere between $25,000 to $50,000, we would say, depending on the project. And then we've been increasing on, maybe the second or third grant once the reporting has been done on the activity. And so, for a food distribution and for a medical distribution, I mean, frankly speaking, the impact measurement is, did it reach the population it was intended for, right? Within the limitations that, you have in a conflict setting. For others, we fund Ukraine Needs You, as I mentioned earlier, the mental health virtual network, right? So we get reports from them on how many people are participating in those group sessions, how many of those people are in fact returning for sessions. They themselves are doing reports on, the impact that those sessions are having on individuals and their coping mechanisms. Because remember, we're dealing in an ongoing conflict. You can't, this is mental, health trauma that's ongoing. So it's about coping mechanisms. And so depending on the set of issues, we are sort of evaluating how people are doing. And some of it's visual. I mean, some of it, was the shelter built? Was it refurbished? Is it in use now? And we try and give to the partners some ability to modulate their budgets, anywhere plus or minus 10%. Because once you get into it, for example, we just had a report this morning from Mission to Ukraine, which we had funded to build out in the western areas that Yana was talking about, to convert a building into a shelter that was actually fit for people, for the exact reasons that it was actually, I believe, a school that was being refurbished. We thought originally it was 10 units. They were able to get 15 units into that, right? So like, those are the kinds of qualitative things we're looking at. And I would just say the last thing, because just to put a fine point on what Javi was talking about, the overhead, or for example, really like paying for keeping the lights on in the office, paying for the people who are filing the reports that Yana has worked on to provide to us that are incredibly detailed, takes money and resources. That's the indirect, that's the overhead costs. And the more we strangle organizations from that, the more we undermine their ability to be effective and to pivot towards the needs that they see evolving during a situation that's so fluid, like in Ukraine. And I'd just say for the last thing is, one of the groups that we just approved and is a very established one, Voices of Children, to me is just indicative of like the situation we're seeing now. They have a focus on children with autism and helping them to deal with pre-war conditions. But imagine, if you have a child who's dealing with autism here in the United States, for example, the sensory overload. Imagine being in a war zone. Imagine being able to help to serve that child to be able to deal with the realities of a bomb raid sign, going off every day, multiple times a day in the East. That's the kind of organizations we're trying to fund. Those are the kinds of organizations that Ropes and Gray is helping us to find. And frankly, those are the kinds of organizations that we need more money to fund. So those of you who've joined, we really appreciate the support. We need more because groups like Yana and others, they're putting their necks on the line literally every day. And so, we're gracious and grateful for what's been given so far, but we need more support. And we know organizations, they're going to do the work because we see it every day. We get reports every morning in our inboxes about that great work. But we're really grateful for everyone joining us today, for sure.
Indeed, and I think with that, I'd like to thank not only all of our esteemed panelists, Jason, Yana, Murphy, Amanda, Abby. Thank you very, very much for not just taking the time to be with us today, but to share your unique insights, which have been hugely helpful, I think, in illustrating the macro and micro level challenges that Ukrainian civilians are facing. But I particularly want to thank all of our audience members who took the time to join us today. Thank you for your support. Supporting Blue Check means supporting the people of Ukraine. And so we encourage you to visit us at bluecheck.in, where you can get more information, where you can make a donation. This webcast also, for those of you who maybe were not able to join us from the outset, it has been recorded. We will be posting it to our YouTube page. I see an anonymous attendee in the chat just now says donating now. Thank you. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your solidarity. Again, thanks to all of you. We look forward to continuing our dialogue with you into the future. And again, bluecheck.in for more information. Thank you again. Have a great day.